Edmonton is one of the fastest growing cities in North America, and the city's building a lot of rail projects to try to shape that growth in every direction. The city has the tallest building in Canada west of Toronto and a lot of good urban basics, from decent transit to a surprisingly good cycling network, and probably most importantly, a lot of people that care deeply about cities, and their city in particular. But Edmonton is facing a big challenge. The region is on pace to reach 2 million residents before 2050. That's as large as Metro Vancouver was around year 2000. And while Edmonton is building a lot of transit, it needs to make sure it's building the right things, and that quantity doesn't trump quality. I'd argue with the benefits of transit being clear and climate change bearing down on us, Edmonton needs to be bold with its transit expansion plans. And it has to build a network that isn't just nice urban table dressing, but a serious alternative to people getting in their cars and trucks. I've shared my opinions lots on LRT in the North American context. Too slow, too infrequent, not competitive with cars. And Edmonton was in fact the first city to adopt this slippery transit technology. And I'd actually argue that the city has one of the best systems in North America, reflected by its rather strong ridership. So let's look at how Edmonton can build a transit network of the future, while upgrading its transit network of today, so that it doesn't need to look to other cities, be it Vancouver, Montreal, or Toronto for inspiration. It can be a transit leader in its own right. Welcome to RM Transit, where I make videos about how transit systems should expand. Consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss any future videos, and supporting me on Patreon so I can bring you more transit-oriented content. On a roughly yearly basis, I make these videos talking about how I would go about expanding various Canadian transit systems, in a way that really focuses on increasing transit mode share and making living in these cities easier without a car. I try to think about network planning in terms of minimizing construction costs, but maximizing connectivity between different lines and services. Right now, Edmonton is working on 3 main rail projects. The Valley Line West, which will extend its namesake line west to Misericordia Hospital, West Edmonton Mall, and Lewis Farms, beyond Anthony Henday Drive, where a small light maintenance facility will be built, and with a slick elevated section along 87th Avenue Northwest. There's also the Capital Line South project, which will take its namesake line south to Twin Brooks and then also across Anthony Henday Drive to another new maintenance yard, this one a much larger one to support Edmonton's high-floor LRT network, and then to a stop at Ellerslie Road in the Heritage Valley area. And then there's the sort of in-the-middle Metro line extension to Nate, but for 5-car trains this time, and Blatchford Gate. And here I want to pause for a moment. Edmonton was early to the light rail trend in North America, with the first such system on the continent. And while we call it light rail, the technology used in Edmonton, Calgary, and a bunch of other cities across the continent is actually used for full subways in countries like Germany and the Netherlands. And Edmonton's system is actually very well set up for this subway style of operation, with super long platforms and its downtown tunnel. Unfortunately though, planners in Edmonton have for years had what I can only call tram envy, and have been trying to push for high floor extensions of the network to use what they call urban LRT principles. Now, I'm all for not just slapping light rail down the middle of the highway and calling it a day. And of course I agree that transit should be easily accessible by foot and by bike. But a lot of these supposed urban LRT principles are just counter to good transit, like trying to make transit slower for urban integration reasons. Unfortunately, you can actually start to see some of this in action, with the winding, level crossing packed route that the Metro line takes up to Blatchford, and the overhead catenary wires on the latest extension up to Blatchford Gate, which are particularly designed to enable slower speeds than the catenary on the rest of the network, which uses a double wire design. This stuff isn't turning the long, high-floor trains into trams, it's turning them into worse, slower transit. Please, Edmonton, start appreciating that you have the beginnings of a subway system, and stop trying to turn it into a slow legacy streetcar system. Fast transit is good. Now, down the road, the plan for the Metro line, which I'm going to reiterate should focus on speed, grade separation, and reliability, is to take it north over the CN Rail Yard and Yellowhead Trail on a dramatic bridge — Edmonton loves dramatic bridges — and then north and west towards St. Albert. Meanwhile, at some point between now and the heat death of the universe, the Capital Line should be extended from Clairview up to Gorman, and the Valley Line should be extended south from Mill Woods, also to Ellerslie Road across the Henday. And there's actually some nice planning that's happened on that segment, since there's already a grassy patch next to the road where the line can run in the future. I guess that will turn the Millwood stop of today into kind of a short turning stub though. And I should note that the Capital Line is also meant to be extended even further south to the very edge of the built-up urban area and the new hospital that's being built there. I will note at this point that Edmonton is basically the best city in North America and one of the best in the world for actually communicating its transit plans, which are laid out in super nice and detailed maps as well as in lovely booklets with yet more maps and beautiful renderings. It's really world-class stuff. But then we get to what's next, after all of the planned projects are completed, probably sometime in the 2030s. I'm going to divide the things I would do to the network into three categories. High floor light rail, which I and the Germans actually call city trains, trams, and then buses and other improvements. For the city train lines, that is the metro and capital lines, I think Edmonton needs to do a few things. For one, drop the whole urban LRT thing. I mean, seriously, what, is there rural LRT? Okay, there actually may be rural LRT. But seriously, the city needs to double down on the metro and capital lines as the high-capacity backbone of the entire transit system, since they have huge capacity, substantially more than the Valley Line, for example. Edmonton made a very smart and forward-thinking move in building the downtown subway right when the rail network was getting started. And the tunnel can essentially pay dividends forever, allowing higher speeds and higher capacity, as well as subway-like frequencies between downtown and the University of Alberta. At one point, Edmonton was actually trying, and unfortunately failing, at implementing CBTC, a high-capacity signaling technology. And while it probably doesn't need the technology across its entire rail network, it probably should still implement it in the downtown tunnel in the long term, to allow for higher frequency, reliable operation, as well as things like platform screen doors. And Edmonton really does need to get into more of a subway mentality with the capital and metro lines, because today the frequencies often aren't great. And yet, in the long term, there's no reason that the core sections of the line shouldn't be able to run every 4 minutes each, allowing the central subway to see a train every 2 minutes. But letting trains run at their most frequent isn't free. For one, Edmonton's going to need more storage space for more trains, which you're seeing being built on the southern extension of the Capital Line, but more yards are probably going to be needed with all of the expansion planned to the network. The city also needs to remove level crossings over time, particularly in dangerous areas, high traffic areas, and in places where the rails are crossing a wide road. Fortunately, as the elevated sections on the Valley Line and the underground sections on the Capital and Metro lines show, Edmonton knows how to do this. Unfortunately though, the removal of the elevated terminus on the Capital Line South extension suggests the city still doesn't entirely get it. But what about the trains themselves? While Calgary got its S200C trains years ago, and they are very nice, Edmonton never made a similar order for the S200 model, which it definitely should be doing, especially now that it's building all of this additional maintenance and storage capacity for additional trains. And I'm actually going to go even further and suggest that the city plan and build any new maintenance capacity, including that new yard on the Capital Line South extension, to support longer trains in the future. You see, the city trains that Edmonton uses on the Capital and Metro lines come in individual cars, which are hooked up together to form longer trains. And this is common across North American cities. But in German cities, like for example Frankfurt, the cars are often designed so that they can be coupled up in such a way that passengers can actually walk from one end of the train to the other. This creates a single long open space in the train that improves security and mobility, but also increases capacity by getting rid of all of the redundant operators' cabs in the middle of the train. Edmonton can and should do this, and it makes even more sense in Edmonton because the system has less level crossings than Calgary. I'd suggest initially starting by ordering sets of end cars so that you could couple those together and form, say, 4-car trains where you have 2 interconnected compartments. But of course in the future, Edmonton could order middle cars which would slot in between those end cars and allow you to create up to 5-car 120-meter walk-through trains, just like in, say, Vancouver or Montreal. Now, we haven't actually talked about expanding the network, so let's do that. To the north, the Metro line should be extended right into St. Albert, probably along St. Albert Trail and up to Erin Ridge Road. And I actually think in the long term, another Metro line branch across the north of the city, traveling up Castle Downs Road and 167th Avenue would be a really good idea. That could even eventually cross Manning Drive and connect to the Capital Line at Gorman, creating some nice suburban connectivity. Also to the north, sort of, I think a connection like with St. Albert, but to Sherwood Park makes a lot of sense. You could do this with a branch splitting off the Capital Line and running on the south side of Yellowhead Trail, and then traveling south along the east side of the Henday and right into the central parts of Sherwood Park. While all of these branches might seem like a lot, that's the benefit of having a high-capacity downtown tunnel. And if frequency in the downtown tunnel is every 2.5 minutes, you can still operate 4 branches up to every 10 minutes. Of course, you can run slightly more frequency on one branch as opposed to another. And unlike in the core of the system, where slow tram-style alignments are a terrible idea, out in the suburbs on a branch that's only seeing, say, 6 trains per hour, urban LRT principles aren't actually the end of the world. And they could actually sometimes be a good way to save some money on infrastructure. I also do want to make mention that some form of rail connection to Fort Saskatchewan would be really nice. It could be built along the existing rail right-of-way, potentially with something like Stadler Flirts operating in a shuttle arrangement where train runs every 30 minutes and there's a passing loop in the middle, but the connection would be really valuable, and it should be tightly integrated with the Capital Line at Gorman so that people can make easy transfers. And honestly, it's worth even considering whether extending the Capital Line as a single track route with that same shuttle-style passing loop in the middle might make sense in the long term, allowing a train every 30 minutes or so to extend all the way out to Fort Saskatchewan. In the meantime though, I think like with all of these extensions, doing something similar to what Vancouver does before it builds a new SkyTrain route, that is implement a rapid bus route that helps build ridership and demand for transit services, but also shows people that there's a commitment to bring higher order transit there in the future if the line is successful, is a good idea. And if you're careful with the way you plan it, you can also use this as a sort of strategy to land bank space for the future rail line once funding and ridership demand is there. To the south, I really think the Capital Line should be extended to Edmonton International Airport, as I talked about in my Alberta Rail video. The reality is, by the time the Capital Line's 2 southern extensions are complete, you're already going to be relatively close to the airport, and the extension all the way down there should be pretty inexpensive, especially if the airport continues to set aside space for the right-of-way into the airport grounds and for space at the terminals for a station. Such an extension does not need to be super expensive. And of course, it's also worth pointing out that lots of people work at the airport and thousands of people every day come and go from it. While Edmonton doesn't have a serious intercity rail station, this is kind of the closest thing, and connecting it up to rail would allow tourists as well as locals to visit and leave the city without having to get into a car. And of course, in the meantime, the 747 bus really badly needs better service. At the same time, in the long term, when rail does eventually make its way down to the airport, and I really do think it will, since Calgary, Ottawa, Montreal, Vancouver, and Toronto, as well as probably Quebec City, are all on the way to having rail connections to their airports, I think that you could also use that rail connection as a nice connection into the community of Leduc to the south. Have a high-frequency bus shuttle, something like that. And if you're wondering why I keep bringing up the transit connections into all of these neighboring communities, the reason is because getting these people on board transit, literally and figuratively, is a good way of ensuring that there's future funding and future political will to continue to expand the network. And then there's one last project, which I would call the Metro Line Southwest Extension. Right now the Metro Line terminates at Health Sciences Jubilee, with a rather awkward off-to-the-side, turn-back track. But it really ought to travel further south on a new branch that separates it from the Capital Line and allows trains to be turned around more efficiently, but also to ideally connect a bunch of communities that are currently kind of isolated between the North Saskatchewan River and White Mud Creek. I think you can fit a flying junction just north of Belgravia Road and then send Metroline trains down there and Fox Road to White Mud Drive and then down to Terwilliger, and perhaps someday even south of the Henday. And then there's the low-floor network, and here I think there are a few projects I would pursue. First of all, I think the extension of the Valley Line south to Ellerslie could also be supplemented by one east to Tamarack. The reason I mention this is because trams every 10 minutes down to Ellerslie Road is totally fine, and so sending some of them to the east also makes sense. I would also supplement that with another low-floor tram corridor that would share infrastructure and tie into the existing Valley Line. In the east, the line would start at a new stop which would be built right next to the Bonnie Doon stop on the existing Valley Line. The line would then travel west on White Avenue to an underground stop at Health Sciences Jubilee at the University of Alberta, and then pop above ground on University Avenue, crossing the river to Buena Vista Park. From here, the line would run northwest and west on Buena Vista Avenue and 87th Avenue to the section of the Valley Line West currently being built elevated between Misericordia and West Edmonton Mall. This section, since it does have some extra capacity, would be a good place to terminate this new corridor that runs down White Avenue. Trains could terminate along the elevated viaduct, which has some additional capacity, creating a connection from Bonnie Doon along White Avenue to the University of Alberta and then to West Edmonton Mall, which I think would be a very useful corridor. This would also be great for residents of Parkview and Laurier Heights, who are quite close to the university today, but have to travel up to 30 minutes on a bus to actually get there on transit. And that takes us to the other improvements. Edmonton already has notably better bus service than Calgary, and the city's mayor actually used to be a bus driver. That being said, there is a lot of room for much nicer bus service in this city. For one, Edmonton should bring back trolley buses, and probably in the articulated, bi-articulated, and battery electric forms, combining the best of old Edmonton Transit and new Edmonton Transit, and of course reducing emissions in the central part of the city. There should also be a rapid bus network like I mentioned before, with lines laid down along the routes of future rail extensions, but also along other corridors such as highways. Some routes that could make sense include from Tamarack to Mill Woods, Southgate, and then West Edmonton Mall via White Mud Drive, downtown along Jasper Avenue and then up to Blatchford, and from Castle Downs to the Science Centre and West Edmonton Mall. Best of all would be a double-decker orbital highway bus service running along Anthony Henday Drive, with dedicated lanes and dedicated bus ramps that would take buses on and off of the highway at major interchange points, including 7 different rail connections and potentially some other ones as well. This would provide excellent frequent and fast suburb-to-suburb transit and seems like a good thing to start to think about developing while the city is starting to grow beyond Anthony Henday Drive in almost every direction. On a completely different note, if Edmonton wants to become a cycling city that incorporates good public transport, then it needs to build high-quality bike parkades at as many rail stations and tram stops as possible, looking at Vancouver as a model. And speaking of the train stations, the busiest ones, again like in Vancouver, should be getting progressively rebuilt over time, so that they have more escalators, more passenger capacity, potentially more platforms, and less grade crossings. Sort of like the rebuild at Stadium Station, but again without pedestrian crossings which limit capacity and create dangerous situations. What's clear to me is that Edmonton can be one of the best transit cities in North America if it wants to be. But if it wants to be, it has to start planning now, and planning ambitiously. Thanks for watching.